And we're back. This module, so we're on module 2 actually, and this module is on AngularJS, which will be the MVC framework, Model View Controller framework, for our front end of the Chirp application, where we can write our cheeps and be merry and jolly and be social. Helen's going to take us through the basic concepts of directives, data binding, using Bootstrap to make things a little pretty, and really build out our front end. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of mimic the data and not connect it to the back end. And afterwards, I'll take that over and we'll actually start linking things together there.
Yeah. So today we're actually going to start by talking about what is a front-end framework. We keep talking about how Angular is one. We keep talking about front-end frameworks and what they are, but how do they work? What are some other ones, and what are their advantages? And then we're actually going to go into directives, which is essentially how you insert Angular code into your HTML document. We're going to go over modules, which are essentially the application containers for any Angular app, controllers, which is how where you're going to put your application logic for your Angular app, as well as the models and data bindings, which is how we're going to actually display to our users our data and what we're getting from the back end, presumably. And then we're going to go into routing, which is interesting because routing is typically something that we do in the back end. We're saying, hey, hit this endpoint or hit this endpoint or go to this page. But you can actually do that from just within a single page application through using Angular routing. And we're going to show you a bit of that as well.
What is a single page app?
So a single page application is, I think one of the canonical things that people talk about when they talk about single page applications is actually Gmail, right? Because it's an application that, it's an application that you'll look at, and it has a lot of different features. You're going to go into a lot of different pages. But actually, when you're clicking into different links and doing different things, even though the URL changes, you're not making a full request to the server for loading a completely new page. You're only loading parts of the page. So you're essentially, even though you're navigating through different elements on the page and going to doing different things, you're actually all doing it within one single page.
Whoa, mind blowing.
Single page application.
So you're telling me that we actually never change pages. We just, it's a big trick.
It is a big trick because you can see the URL changes. You can actually even go to the different URLs and it'll bring you to that exact part of the single page application. But I mean, the advantage is that since you're using that, you're only loading exactly what you need. So you don't need to load your resources twice if you're calling the same JavaScript file, for instance.
So it's a bit snappier.
Yeah, definitely. So let's go in and talk about front-end frameworks and what they are. A lot of these front-end frameworks build the single-page applications that we just talked about. So a framework is something that will actually structure out your application, such as Angular. Whereas there are libraries like jQuery that have a lot of useful functions that make JavaScript a little bit easier to manipulate, to give you a lot of helper functions, and basically make your JavaScript interactions less painful. They might even, like jQuery, come with a lot of add-ins that will allow you to do cool transitions or decent effects, and they'll also allow you to, for instance, make HTTP requests or XHR requests more easily. But AngularJS and other MVC frameworks will do that plus a lot more. So whereas jQuery, for instance, doesn't really care about how you structure out your application so long as you include your jQuery application in, Angular will actually say, hey, put all your logic specifically here in your views or in your HTML templates that you're using to display the page, put in where the code actually goes. Put in what elements actually belong here, and you're really separating out a lot of logic. So AngularJS and other MVC frameworks are a lot more opinionated in that way.
That's what I was about to say. Opinionated is kind of like what it seems to be, whereas jQuery is really unopinionated.
Yeah. So Angular is an MVC front-end framework, much like a lot of other ones, such as Backbone or Ember. Yep. And there are quite a few popular JavaScript MVC front-end frameworks. Sorry, that is a mouthful out there. Angular is something that is probably more opinionated than the rest because they really want to structure out, like we said before, how HTML apps would look, or how HTML would be if HTML was written to build web apps. So with that comes a lot of things. So why use Angular in particular? Well, as we said before, it keeps your code really, really organized and structured. You're going to probably put all your controllers in one place, and you will specify that, hey, these are the things that are specifically modifying the data before we're pushing it out for users to view. There's also two-way data binding, which is something that I think we touched lightly on before. But what that basically is saying is that if you change around your data and apply some logic to it, for instance, in your controller, it's automatically going to change and appear differently in your front end when you're looking at that, because that data is bound between the application's view and the application's logic and control.
So if I have like a list of cheaps, and so we add a new cheap into the list, it'll just automatically show up in the UI?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're actually going to go into a short demo about this. In a little bit. We already
In 1 second, after this next slide.
Yeah, this slide basically goes over the other frameworks that are out there. React actually calls itself technically a library.
Yeah, I think they just call itself the Vue, the V.
Yeah, they call themselves the V in MVC. But I threw it in here because it's really up and coming. It's really, really cool. It's much more performant than the other frameworks out there, specifically because it only tries to do one thing, and it tries to do that one thing well. Ember tries to emulate, I think, more of like I would say more Ruby-like in what it wants to do, or more Ruby on Rails-like in what it tries to do in terms of syntax and structure. And yeah.
I've actually never used Ember myself. I've used Backbone. I think that was the last one on the list. And that one's a little bit lighter. It's a little bit more bare bones. It actually doesn't have data binding. You have to like add other libraries to do that. So if you like more minimalistic, less opinion, Backbone's pretty good. I've used that even with Win.js and put those two together, and it worked pretty well. So.
Yeah, and I think actually I've used Angular with Win.js as well, and that also worked quite well. Since these are all JavaScript files that you can essentially include in, a lot of times they will work pretty much out of the box or with minor changes.
Yep.
So to summarize, React is great if you want something that's highly performant and very lightweight, and you only want to manipulate the views. Backbone is great if you want a little bit more MVC structure, but you still want to keep things lightweight. And Ember is great if you're already a Ruby on Rails user, and if you like that sort of framework. Angular, though, I think is only one still with two-way data binding, which is quite nice.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I don't actually remember. So.
Yeah, I think the other ones have one-way data binding. Which means it'll get something from your if you change something in the controller, it'll change it in your view. But what's actually nice about two-way data binding is that if you change something in your view, it'll automatically change that in your controller as well.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Inception.
So let's actually go and look at that. We'll go into our module 2 and open Hello World.
Beautiful.
So as you can see here, right now we have just a really, really plain page, and it says hello. And I'm actually going to open the developer console here so you could see what is happening in the DOM. So as you can see here, we are saying, hey, make this app an Angular app just by putting ng app on top. And what we're actually saying is, hey, use this text box here as the input. So we're going to give this ng model. We're going to call this ng model input text, and that basically starts that data binding process by saying, hey, this is the data that we're going to share. And so now when we bind, doesn't exactly show up here.
So the live DOM, Helen, I think you're expecting the brackets, right?
I am expecting the brackets. You're right. I'm going to go
into
here.
Yeah, there you go.
And you'll see that we put actually input text here. So we're saying, hey, this model here, this input is going to be what our input text is, and we're going to call, and that's our model. And now with the binding, it's actually going to bind this to wherever we put this input text in brackets here. So now whenever we change something in this input, it'll actually change automatically here where we want it to be displayed.
Okay, so it's like magic. It's basically Angular looks at those brackets and says, oh, I have this spot of data that I need to fill in, and it binds to this thing called input text.
Yeah, it'll bind to whatever model you're given. So we're going to use this much later on to do a bit more complex things. And you'll notice that I talked a lot about controllers, but we don't actually have a controller here. You can actually bind this with all your logic not on the same page as well. I think that actually makes it look much more impressive than right here when we're saying, oh yeah, you know, you put the input text here, and then you're basically getting the input text again.
It looks like magic, really. One quick question: can we do this in Visual Studio? Can we do this in any text editor? Like what's required here?
Yeah, so right now we're using Sublime Text just as a really, really lightweight text editor, but you can absolutely use Visual Studio or anything else as well. We're using Sublime Text primarily because that's the...
It's cross-platform.
Yeah, it's cross-platform, and a lot of web developers really enjoy using it, so we thought we'd use the tools that other people use for things like JavaScript frameworks, basically.
Yeah, but really it's just opening a directory, so
yeah, exactly.
It's about the same thing as anything else.
Yeah. When you're actually opening something in a straight text file like this and you're seeing that you can make changes just straight in this text file, I think it really shows that everything we're doing is basically, straight JavaScript and not that complex.
Yep.
So now that we've done a tiny hello world, let's actually go through and talk about exactly what we did. And the first thing that we'll talk about are directives. So directives are those Angular-only HTML attributes that we add into our application. You could see from if you think back to our hello world, when we called ng app or when we called something an ng model, those are basically directives. You put them in your HTML tag just to denote that, hey, this is going to be an Angular, this is going to be an element that we're going to use with Angular. And it'll attach some specific behavior to the element. So for example, when we said ng app for the entire, to the HTML tag that's saying, hey, this entire page is going to be an Angular application. And when we set ng model to that text field again, you're saying, hey, this text field is going to be an Angular data model. And you can tell something is an Angular directive by the prefix that it has, which will usually be ng dash or data dash ng dash, or actually data dash ng colon is, I think, what it usually is.
Yeah.
So if you look in Source Code for a lot of your favorite websites, you'll probably see something like this already.
Well, data dash is the common attribute if any type of JavaScript or any type of library wants to add data to the DOM. Or wants to denote or say something about that particular element in the DOM. And it doesn't just work for Angular, it works for a lot of other frameworks use data dash as well.
Yeah. This is, it's just a nice, so that's why there are two formats. There's the ng dash, to keep it simple, and then there's the data dash ng, which is sort of the more universal model that's out there. The directives in Angular are actually one of its key features, because there are so many directives that you can use, and it makes it so easy to just denote that this is an Angular element instead of, for example, in jQuery or whatever else. You have to actually go in your JavaScript and say, hey, I want to do something to this element. So next, let's talk about models and controllers. So we touched on this lightly a little bit before, but the models are basically the data that you're going to pass around, and the controllers are where your logic is going to sit. So a module is probably the biggest type of sort of directive, and everything is going to sit inside of a module. So the module you can think of as the container for your entire application. And you declare it pretty simply in your Angular code. So you'll have one JavaScript. We're going to basically use one JavaScript file for all your Angular code. You can, of course, separate this out a little bit more, but we don't have that much code today. So we're just going to keep it in one file. And at the top of your file, you're just going to type in var and give your module a name, and then you'll just use angular.module. And the my app here, that's going to be what you're going to call your app in the in your view. So right here, we're just going to give an example, for instance, my app. So this is what you would call your directive with ng app using. And next, you'll see we have some empty brackets here. The empty brackets are basically where you're going to put in your dependencies. So if you need another type of Angular resource, or if you're calling in some specific library, that's where you'd put those. Because we're starting out simple right now, we're not going to use it just quite yet. And controllers are what are going to contain, again, the business logic for a part of your application. So you can have multiple controllers per Angular module. These will typically correspond with one core function or one core view, or basically one part of your application. And controllers, basically, all they do is they set up your data to be viewed in your HTML. So you're going to, for instance, massage your data, reset it in the controller, set it different things, and you're actually going to declare it with some similar syntax. So as you recall, for instance here, we called our Angular application, or Angular module, my module. So you could just declare a controller onto that, as you see here, and give it a name, like my controller. And you'll actually give it a function here. So that's interesting, because what we're basically doing is we're going to put our code between these braces here. And you'll see we passed in a scope. So this is how we talked about before, if you need any dependencies, you eject them in the square brackets for a module. Here, if you have any dependencies, you could just simply put them as a parameter for the function. So we already have something here in its scope. Now, scope is something that just every controller is going to need, and that's where you're actually going to keep your data models. So that's essentially everything in your scope is going to be what is passed around to your views. So dependency injection is how we're going to specify those dependencies for Angular component that we need. This is basically, the scope that we're putting into our controller, and it's what we put in our square braces. Angular is very, very big on dependency injection, because that's essentially how you're going to add in only the components that you need for a controller. Instead of declaring everything, for instance, at the top and basically making everything available, you say, well, what do I specifically need for this one controller or this one module? And templates are going to be the angularized HTML that we're going to create. So
what does angularized mean?
I'm not sure that that's a real term. That's basically just what I put in. It's any HTML code that you're going to use along with Angular. So instead of saying, so we're going to just call those templates, because as you can see, or as we saw before, what you see in your browser, that code is going to be different. That's going to be actually the rendered view. But what you're using to create that sort of Angular HTML shell, which in our hello world, for instance, was this. This is going to be a template. The templates will typically, you'll see the braces, and this is and you're going to see a lot of that Angular structuring. So it's basically template is a really straightforward word. That's exactly what it does.
Angularized,
right?
like hello angularized means that it's using the double brackets, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So your templates are going to be basically the constructed views, or you know what? They're the templates for your views.
Templates, yeah.
I don't know why I keep trying to explain a really simple word. It is a template. So yeah, actually, let's go in and build out just those simple pieces for our Chirp Angular app.
Awesome.
So just to orient you guys around Sublime, for those of you who haven't used it before, you can actually access your file structure here. And we have one giant folder for our Chirp app, which I put in desktop because, easy access. I know a lot of people don't like that, but hey, it's a demo. And you'll see that I have the completed folder here, and I also just have, the rest of the folder structure here.
So the completed folder has what?
Oh, the completed folder basically has what we're going to end up with at the end of the module, but we're going to create the module from scratch in a new folder that we're going to start here. I just wanted to showcase this because if you haven't used Sublime Text before, this is not like any crazy project view like you might see in Visual Studio. This is basically just going to be
it's just doing
the folder structure. Yeah, you're just seeing the directories as they exist here, and you can see the other modules here, and it maps basically one-on-one to this. So I've just created this empty app folder, and this is where we're going to start off. If you want to follow along and you want some more detailed instructions, you can, of course, go to our GitHub repo. Let me go here, and as you can see, we're actually going to go through basically what we're going to do here in this module2 folder. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create an Angular module and a controller, and that's going to be the file that we're going to contain the rest of our code in. So I'm going to just create a new file here in Sublime, and I'm going to, you know what? I'm just going to copy paste this code in. So I can describe it to you better. So what we did here is we basically constructed a module, like we said before. We're calling this variable app, and we're going to use that throughout our application. But more specifically, it is the chirp app, and that's what we're going to call it in the view later on. And we just constructed a really empty controller called main controller, and I'm actually going to just start passing in the scope right now and leave this blank for the time being. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to call this just chirp app.js. Putting an application folder, and I'm actually going to put it in a separate folder called JavaScripts, just to clean that up a little bit, and save that here. And next, we're going to create that basically main page that you'll see when you're on our chirp application. So because HTML is really, really verbose, I'm going to use this template. Otherwise, it'll take me forever to type out.
Yeah, those brackets are really annoying.
Yeah, and what we're going to do here is we're basically going to create that HTML file. So right now, this doesn't have any Angular code in it. As I would say, it is not Angularized. Sorry. I'm trying to make it a thing, OK? I'm trying to make this term happen.
Hashtag Angularized.
Angularized, yeah, exactly. And all we have in here is it's just basically a form. We're going to, within this form, we're going to have an input called your name, for your name, and we're going to have a text area for your chirp. Normally, you type in. Normally, you wouldn't need to type in your name if you're building an application like this because it just save your username. But because we don't have a backend yet, we're just going to have you manually enter your name whenever you're
cheaping.
Whenever you're cheaping, exactly. And there's going to be a submit button. I made a div for a feed down here, but that's obviously not going to be used yet. And I have an extra div here, so I'm just going to save this. And I'm going to call this main.html. So right now, if we go in and we actually look at main.html, it's not very pretty, right? It's completely unstyled, and basically I just have the name input and the say something here. And I can type in things here, but it won't really do anything since that submit button isn't connected to anything. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to start Angularizing this. And I'm going to put the ng app actually on the body instead of the full HTML document, and I'm going to call this chirp app. It's important for what you do here to map to or what you're calling the application here with ng app to actually map to what you're going to call it here.
So I can't call it whatever I want. It has to match Angular, module name of the Angular module name.
Exactly. And we'll also want to include this chirp-app.js file. So for time's sake, I'm going to, again, just copy this. And
so what is that there?
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to explain it in just 1 second. So we're going to call in two scripts. One is, like we said before, we need basically the AngularJS base scripts from the Google CDN. So I'm just pulling in that CDN code here with this first script. And the second thing we're going to do is we're actually going to link this to our chirp-app.js that we created in our JavaScripts folder. So the order of that is pretty important. You want your Angular code to go first so that your app actually knows what it's accessing. And we're going to save this. Now, this won't actually do much because we don't have a controller or anything in here. So what we want to do is we want to specify, hey, what part of the app is this controller that we're making called main controller modifying. And what we're going to modify is basically this main div. So whatever is basically under this div or within this div is going to be accessible with the ng controller.
Okay.
And again, it's important for this name to match with what you're going to pass into main controller, what your name is going to be here.
Oh, I got a good question in the chat. They asked, wouldn't you place the CDN link at the bottom of your file rather than the top? Sometimes you do that for loading for performance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want your site to be extremely performant, extremely fast, you absolutely should place your JavaScript includes at the bottom of the page, because the way that these things load is you'll have that first pass where you load all your elements in, and then you'll actually load, and then you'll go through and you'll load your scripts, and then that'll go through and basically connect what you're connecting with the script. This is just the very standard HTML way that people have learned.
Yep.
So I'm doing this for simplicity's sake instead of actually making anything
Nothing
super
fancy.
performant today. If we wanted to do that, we probably also do a couple of other tweaks. But this, I think, makes things very clear. So after we've added in the controller, next we want to actually connect our model and view. So because we don't actually have anything in our controller here, let's actually learn what we would put in. So what we're going to put in our controller are basically our models, and we're going to, again, modify with that scope. And we're going to use data binding to pass whatever we're doing in the controller over to our view or our template. So something that we're going to use that's really important is that scope that you see we passed in before. And what that scope does is it links your controller to your view. So that kind of sounds confusing, but basically, whatever you're going to attach to that scope is going to be made available to your template view as a variable. So similar to what we did before with that ng model, if you apply that ng model with something that is available in the scope, that's going to be able to be used. This is a confusing concept until you see it in action, so we're going to show that in a little bit. But what you want to basically remember is the scope contains all your models for the data that you're going to be using. And the scope is always configured within the controller for that specific section. And every time you're creating a new controller, you're setting basically a new scope inside of that controller and that element that you created that controller for. And so let's talk about displaying and binding data. As you've seen before in our Hello World application, you can display data once you have a model for it just by simply using some double braces. You're going to actually bind that data using directives like what we did before. So what we did was we used ng model for Hello World, and that will create that two-way data binding we talked about, which will basically bind your data from both your view into your controller as well as your controller into your view. So whenever something changes in your view, that changes automatically in our controller as well. And our ng bind is a slightly different function, and that'll basically create one-way data binding. So whatever changes in your controller will actually populate out to your view, but it won't go back the other way. And ng bind is obviously more performant than ng model since it doesn't have to actually create that watching. But we're going to use ng model because when we're populating the form, it's actually going to change the model that we've created in our controller, as you'll see now.
So we're doing two-way data binding.
Yeah, we're going to do two-way data binding. One-way data binding is really useful if you're, for instance, displaying some data out that you fetch from the server that you know isn't necessarily going to change. But especially for something like what we're doing here, where you're going to input data and you want that to be, you want that data to, have some sort of action applied onto it. It's just so useful because you don't have to, pass that data back into your controller. It's already there for you whenever you're changing it.
So it's basically one way is good for displaying, two way is good for user input.
Yeah, exactly. So now what we want to do here is first we want to go into our main controller and we want to start creating some variables on our scope. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create posts. And we're going to make this an empty array for now. I'm actually going to remember to attach this onto our scope. And we're going to make this an empty array for now. And that'll basically contain all the posts that we're going to display on the page. Once we have a backend, of course, we're going to get our posts from there. But for now, we're just going to start it out empty every time.
Now, when you add stuff to the scope variable, it goes to any other controller that's using it can have access?
No. So the scope that you're creating is only going to be available for whatever you put in your controller here. So, for instance, this div right here, this is. Am I highlighting that correctly? Okay, so because we put in our main controller onto this main div, the only things that can access this, the scope variables are going to be inside this div. If, for instance, we had another div down here, and we gave that another controller, then that controller will, then the elements underneath that will only be able to access that controller's own scope.
Its own scope. Okay, got it.
Yeah. We're going to talk about root scope a little bit later on, but there is a way to, provide entire scope to your entire module. That shouldn't be used too much. We're going to use it for
globals
one thing at the end. Yeah, believe it or not, globals are bad. There's a preferred way to actually pass data around Angular application, and we'll get to that, I think, in Module 5. Meanwhile, we're going to actually create another scope variable, and we're going to call that new post. And this is what's going to basically contain our, we're going to model this to our form right here. So what we'll need right now is we'll need a name, and we'll also need some text, basically the text of that chirp. So let's go and initialize that real quick. I'm going to call the username created by, make that empty for now.
You probably don't need those vars, right?
No, but it's nice to know what you're, it's just, I think, a good practice to say, hey, what is going to actually be used? And actually, because we're going to use ng model later on, we want to specifically tie, for instance, the text the text box for your name specifically to a new post created by, for instance. So as soon as that changes, this is actually going to change. And you'll actually, by adding it in here, you'll actually also know exactly what models you're going to use explicitly. So it makes for cleaner code, I think, to initialize it here, even if you don't necessarily need to. I'm also going to initialize text. And I'm going to do something else. I'm going to actually create it at. Because as you've seen in Twitter, and as you're going to see in our application, we want some timestamps. And so the created at is basically going to store a timestamp. I'm going to leave that empty for now, but that's all we'll really need here. So now let's actually go through and add each of these scope variables and attach them as models here. When I say each, I actually do not mean we should do the timestamp as well. We're actually just going to do the created by on the your name text input, and I'm going to call that, or I'm going to use ng model, and I'm going to use new post dot created by. And you'll notice that I'm actually not using scope here, whereas I use scope here. And that's because this entire scope is already passed to this controller. And the only things it can access are just basically the scope variables. So you could just call them by what you named them here.
Scope is implicitly
Yeah,
defined.
Scope is implicitly defined. And for the text area, we're going to do something similar. We're going to do ng model, and we're just going to give it new post dot text. I'm actually going to also set this input up here for the name as required real quick. So now that we have these two, what are we actually going to do when this form posts? Well, we need to add in the post here to the form. And for and just for timing purposes, I'm actually going to paste the rest of this in. So what we're going to use is we're going to use ng submit for the form posting, and it'll basically call a post function. And in here, we're going to create another. Let me just go down here, paste that in as well. We're going to create a post function on our scope so that it can actually be called in our application here. I'm gonna indent this a little bit better so you could see. But what we're doing in our form is we're calling ng submit post. So whenever whenever the submit button on this form is clicked, it's actually going to call this post function. And so we then define that post function actually on our scope as well. So the scope will be a function that basically creates or adds a created at to the new post here. So whereas before it was blank and we didn't necessarily change it in our model at all, we're actually going to change that here and make that date.now, which is essentially going to be the current timestamp. And then we're actually going to post this or push this to posts. We're going to take whatever we created in new post, the actual populated post, and we're going to add that into our scopes.post. And then we're going to reset new post here. So once we save this, you'll notice that we actually don't display the chirp feed here at all. And we're going to display that in just 1 minute. We're going to display that using our basically filters. Or actually, I don't think I'm supposed to do this.
That's what we're at.
Yeah.
That's what I was asking about.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. So once we add this in here, we should actually be able to post into our posts array. Now, we're going to just actually be able to see our post array if we actually display it here. So let's go in and create that display. So we're going to display this pretty primitively right now, just by creating a div. And what we're going to use this interesting ng repeat directive using some filtering.
What does ng repeat do?
Excellent question. Let's look at some definitions for that. Oh no, I can't because I don't have it.
I'm sure you could freehand it.
Yeah, I am going to just tell you what it does. So I had this entire section on like filters and repeating, and I don't know where
Got
it is
lost
now.
on the internet.
I lost it somewhere between pushing it up to GitHub and now. But basically, what ng repeat does is it's going to take this posts array here, and it's going to say, well, for every post that I have in posts, so it's going to iterate through all of post. And it's going to take every single element and it's going to assign that temporarily to post. And it's actually going to create a new scope in here. I hope that's not too confusing for you. And what it's going to do is it's going to make that post be available to whatever is subsequently inside this div. We're going to perform some filtering functions onto it using order by. So typically, if you don't have this right now, it'll just populate that list for you, top to bottom, and whatever's first in post is going to be displayed first. By using order by and giving it an element here, what we're actually saying is, hey, can you actually order how we're going to traverse through posts by its created at times? So it's going to do it chronologically, essentially. And I'm passing it another parameter here, true, and that is basically. The third parameter for order by is basically, do you want to reverse this order? So I'm saying true here simply because I want it to be displayed reverse chronologically with the most recent post first. And then you'll see that there's some extra directives that I added in here that are pretty interesting. ng class odd will basically apply this class onto any all the odd posts within our posts, and ng even is going to apply that to all the even posts. Now, this will be useful for styling a little bit later on, so stay with me for now on this. And next, you'll see we're going to create a post created by here. So the post created by is going to be just displaying the username that someone put in, and then it'll just say the text after a little says, and it's going to show the timestamp. Now, this isn't formatted at all, so it's not going to look very pretty for now. But let's save this and run our app for the first time.
Oh.
I just needed to allow that content. No worries here. And you'll see we can type in our name. This, again, looks pretty similar to what we had before, but once we actually click that chirp button, you'll see it actually passed that model already to the controller without us having to say anything, just because of the way that ng model does two-way data binding. And you'll see here, since it's pushed it to the post, and post is also bound using this repeat loop, it's automatically going to show up kind of magically.
OK, so that was the reverse data binding that we were talking about, right? Well,
Yeah, exactly. Because we're typing in something here, even in our view, it'll bind back into
it binds back into
Yeah, exactly.
the
It binds back into the scope, and that's accessible within our controller. So we didn't explicitly have to pass, the name or the content of the chirp to our controller. It already knows that because we already created that the new post as a scope variable.
Nice.
And the same thing is true for the posts array, because the posts array is bound to the view whenever that changes within our scope. Like when we add, for instance, our new chirp into it, it's going to just cheap into it. It's going to it's going to automatically display here. So we can do a couple of other ones, and you'll see because we use the order by parameter true, it's actually going to display reverse chronologically. So the new things that I'm saying is going to appear on top in that repeat. So that works. It doesn't work super well, but it works. It's extremely unattractive as a web page, I must say.
It's simple.
It is simple. It's very minimalist. I think people like that right now. But let's actually go in and add some styling. So we're going to actually just throw some bootstrap on there. That's a term that I've heard Stephen use quite often. Just throw some bootstrap on there.
Yeah, just sprinkle it on there.
And add some formatting. And there's a lot of formatting that we're going to use. So I'm just going to copy this real quick and replace this. So let's actually go through and look at what we changed. All we did is we added in this Bootstrap CSS style sheet. And we, of course, also added in the style CSS here. I don't have that created in this app folder. So let's actually create that now. And I'm going to call this, I'm going to call this style.css. And
if you actually just put the name of the file on the first line and hit save, it'll actually save it as that.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that. I've always saved it separately. I'm going to cheat and get my style sheet from here and just
So this is styling specific for our app.
Yeah, this is styling that I made specifically for our app. So for instance, it'll change the submit button style, the post, and it's actually going to give it, according to the different classes that the ng even, ng odd gave it, I'm going to give it different background colors accordingly. And I've also, formatted the posts a little bit. And that's going to be included here. So I'm going to save this as a new file inside here. I'm going to put it inside a new folder called Style Sheets. And save it here as style.css. Style.css. Cool. So now that we see it in a directory view here and we linked it here, we can actually run this. Let me just show you one more thing that I did. So whereas before we basically had 3 text tags and we just put them in line, I'm actually going to format each of the cheaps a little bit better. So it'll be, you'll see, but it'll basically say the text on top. It'll say the posted by on bottom. And I'm actually formatting the created by timestamp a little bit using an ng filter. So this is going to, instead of giving it basically the number of milliseconds from the beginning of time, it's actually going to format this into a human readable date format. You can read this about this a little bit more in the ng or in the Angular documentation, but you're basically saying, hey, filter this number of milliseconds is actually, the date, which is as a date, which would be the time on a certain day. This is much clearer once you actually see it running, so let's go ahead and do that. I always close my pages and I always open up a new one, which is not smart, but there we go. Typing in Helen, and then I'm going to type in a nice format. I'm going to compliment myself here. and I'm going to click this chirp button. And you'll see that it's actually styled a little bit better. And more importantly, that date timestamp is going to look much better than it did before. And when we do another one, because of the way that we did our ng even and odd, we're actually going to alternate background colors.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's pretty.
So we have this, sort of done, but we're actually going to need a couple of new pages. In addition to just this page, we actually will need a login page and and an authentication page as well. So let's go in and create those. We're going to just create the templates for now. And you can see here that this is going to basically create the registration page. I know I didn't need to delete that comment on top, but it definitely bothered me. And I'm going to save this as register. And you can see here, this does pretty similar things. We're going to give it an ng model here for our username. We're going to give it a password here, for our user password here. And we're actually going to put this all in an auth controller. We've, again, added some styling in with the help of Bootstrap and our own little CSS file. And we also associate this with that ng app chirp app, as we did before. So we created basically the models for this, but we don't actually have that auth controller that is needed to power this, this entire div and this entire authentication element. So let's go in and create that. We're going to actually need to create a new controller for it as well, because we want to separate those scope things. So we're going to create this auth controller separately, and we're going to call that auth controller, just as we did before here. So as you can see, we're still passing in scope, and we're passing in a user and so we're going to create a user scope variable as well as an error message scope variable. That error message should just display to the user, hey, what's wrong with your login if their authentication failed. But for now, since we don't actually have an authentication backend, whenever they click login, we're just going to say, hey, thanks for trying to log in with this username. We're going to do the same for a registration by saying, hey, thanks for registering with this username, and just having that be our login function and our register function for now. So our register HTML, for instance, will do a similar thing to what we did before. On submit of that registration form, it's just going to call this register function. And pretty much we're going to build the exact same thing as a registration page, but for login. So we can essentially actually just copy this, create a new folder, create a new document. Make sure to change this to login, and change the button to actually say login, change the header to say login, and that's going to be our login page. It's going to work pretty much exactly the same way as our registration. So what you're going to notice is, hey, you're using the same auth controller for both your login and your register. Why are you doing that? How can you do that? Well, I mean, you can assign controllers to whatever different views you need. And because we basically need the same scope variables for both, we're just going to reuse one controller and give them different functions to access. That should not be in there. And we're going to just save this. And that should give it the authentication, as well as the login and the registration. So once we save this, we can actually go in and, for instance, look at our registration page. When I, try to register, for instance, it's just going to display that registration alert here in our error message, which we defined in our form here, which we defined in our scope variable here, as well as in our form here. And we just bound that to the scope's error message, like so. So because we're running a little bit short on time, we're going to save the routing piece, I think, for Module 5.
OK, so you're going to throw that in Module 5?
Yeah.
OK.
But essentially, we're just going to go through and let's look at the 3 pages that we created. We created a login page here, allow block content. We created a main page here, allow block content. And we created that register page here, allow block content. So Stephen is actually going to go through and create the backend for this application now using Node, Express, and Mongo in the next couple of modules. And when we come back, we're going to tie these 3 separate pages into one cohesive single-page application. So you're actually only accessing it from a single page and not clicking around. And we're going to tie that backend in as well.
Awesome. Sounds great. We'll see you guys soon.